Hello, everyone, and thank you again for joining me. The weather today has been fairly pleasant, albeit a bit cold. A light rain antagonized the evening, but it was lovely nonetheless. Last workshop, we left off on the topic of lesbianism, specifically the historical practice of it, and some of the thoughts and ideas about it. Towards the end of the video, and come to think of it, towards the beginning as well, I was considering touching on the topic of transsexuality when it comes to speaking of sexuality. I thought a bit more on that subject and realized that it would be better for someone who's transsexual and lives that reality to give their experience of it and take you for a walk in their shoes. I feel the same way about the talk with lesbianism as well, so I decided last workshop to stick to more of the historical context of it. Within that realm as well, I'd rather have someone who's living that reality speak on it when it comes to what it's like, rather than speak on it with my own male and inherently biased and privileged opinion. That being said, I do embrace my feminine, quote, side rather lovingly. Now, to that regard, I don't believe in a feminine or masculineness. I believe these things, these notions of masculinity and femininity, are social and human constructs. I purposely worded that last sentence to see if you were engaged in it as well. Did you not realize I put the masculine before the feminine when wording that sentence? If you identify more with feminine attributes, quote, or characteristics, you more than likely did. However, if you're not in tune with that very nature, then you more than likely miss it altogether. I believe if there is a masculine and a feminine, then they are half of yourself. Because of that, that means that neither is the whole, and the whole is separate from both halves, yet combined. And because of that, there is no masculine or feminine. So this workshop, we will dabble on heterosexuality and the dangers of enforced gender roles on society and people, speaking of masculinity and femininity. We will analyze how these forced roles are not only emasculating to the perceived masculine, they are the opposite by nature. Not only are they unfair to the feminine, they are unfit. And we aren't talking about only clothes. We will discuss a point or two in history when heterosexuality was questioned, or rather different, the notions of heterosexuality. When there are less gendered norms and more free-form, like jazz. Creativity of your own person was allowed, and you weren't forced to adhere to some invisible yet visible social norm of what you wear, how you act, and what you like. All created and designed for you before you could even walk, before you could speak and be heard, maybe before you even open your eyes. So what is it to be masculine? Take a moment and think about what that means to you. A few buzzwords are strong, assertive, powerful, logical, reasonable, hairy, tough, brave, pants, suit, tall, dark, handsome, carnivore, musk, independent, dominant, heterosexual. These buzzwords have been programmed into us since we started to contextualize the world around us because of their programming. Nothing original, at least until recently. As a masculine being, male or female, there are certain expectations. We'll concentrate on the male side of things for now. Young boys are expected to be rough and dirty and allowed to do so. However, when's the last time someone allowed their daughter to do the same thing? And why not? As a boy, you're expected to be fragile, unbreakable, not fragile. Yet that very notion of masculinity has caused an uptick in suicides among men and boys for years. And that's not to say that these issues haven't existed since the dawn of man. Men have gone to war over fragile masculinity. You must show your strength. You must not let them talk to you like that. You must command respect. The only reason these things are even necessary are because the other party is also afflicted by the same virus known as toxic masculinity that the speaking party is infected with. Is it possible that one of because there are many, of the most horrific acts of violence and genocide are caused by toxic masculinity at its core. What if I told you that the toxically masculine principle of heterosexuality repressed an infamous mass murderer by the name of Adolf Hitler so much to the point of killing millions of people? If his homosexuality and its repression caused him to lash out, what he was expected to be as a masculine male. An excerpt from The Peculiar Sex Life of Adolf Hitler reads, "During his childhood, Hitler was beaten viciously and often by his father, Alois, and adored by his gentle mother, who tried to protect him from his father's whip and belt. Hitler later said that his fondest childhood memories were of sleeping alone with his mother in the big bed." Reminds you of a bit of an Oedipus complex, does it not? The reading continues. While his father was away at work. Throughout his life, his devotion to the memory of his mother Clara continued, but he rarely, if ever, spoke of his father. For most of his life, Hitler was predominantly homosexual. In his teens and early 20s, he had a string of exclusive male companions, quote, including August Kubizek, Reinhold Hanitsch, and Rudolf Hössler. He shared accommodation with these men in seedy Viennese or Munich backstreets and in homes for the destitute, quote. So not only did he have to hide his homosexuality and only examine it in the backstreets, no pun intended, of Munich, but he was dealing with severe trauma from his father. It's considered a very masculine thing to physically reprimand your child. Toxically masculine, in fact. This was a trait that was more than likely passed on by his father's father to him, and then, of course, we see how it was doled out. This tradition of beating children, which is still practiced today by primates, monkeys, and chimps alike, somehow is being continued and perpetuated. What if his father beat him because he didn't approve of his homosexuality? I mean, it's not too far-fetched to assume that his father was a fairly conservative man, heterosexual, and probably religious. Also, I'd like to note that the word conservative overlaps in both masculine and feminine perceptions. I mean, it wouldn't be the first time anyone has heard of a strictly conservative and, quote, masculine parent trying to beat the gay away or pray it away. And in the same breath, spare no rod against their own child, who they beat as if they were their enemy. In a so-called Nazi book-burning ceremony, he had all the sexual perversion records relating to himself and his Nazi colleagues at Berlin Psychiatric Clinic destroyed. In June to July of 1934, he organized the murders and imprisonment of hundreds of Nazi stormtroopers, including their leader, Queen Ernst Röhm, who was openly gay. However, while gay Nazis were being butchered or imprisoned, Hitler was having a secret affair with his Munich chauffeur, Julius Schreck. The two were apparently devoted to each other and enjoyed romantic trysts at the Hotel Bouvet, or Boob, depending on how you like to pronounce that. I'm possibly butchering it. And this was near Bernick, at the midway point between Berlin and Munich. Their affair lasted until Schreck's sudden death from meningitis. When he heard the news, Hitler wept uncontrollably for several days. And people don't tend to do that unless it's their lover. Schreck had fulfilled Hitler's fantasies about the great love between a powerful man and his obedient servant. The homosexual Bavarian king Ludwig II, who had conducted a 20-year affair with his coachman, was one of the German dictator's heroes. He wanted to go to art school. He wanted to have a boyfriend. He wasn't not sexually satisfied. And if you recall back in our earlier workshops, I briefly described the dangers of people when sexually unsatisfied. How dangerous they can get. I mean, we've seen it time and time again. He lived in a world unaccepting of his true self, his artsy, gay self. Now, I'm not an apologist for him. I'm merely stating how one could find logic in his madness. Hypothetically speaking, what if the world was, instead of intolerant of those things, hyper-tolerant of them, or indifferent even? What if those dreams and early aspirations had been supported fully? Would he have committed those same acts of violence? Genocide? Would he have led a group of men who probably suffered from the same afflictions into genocide? Is it possible and likely that toxic masculinity was the cause? The problem with toxic masculinity and forced roles and actions due to perceived gender is that no one really knows where the line starts and ends. It's hard to pinpoint exactly where the problems are because there are so many of them, and most people see no problem with them. Masculine, quote, dress has changed over time. In the earliest horse riding cultures, then trousers as a form of clothing connected to horses also served as a sign of prestige. The earliest existing pair of pants was found in China and dates to around 1000 BCE, within 1,000 years of the time when it was believed horses were initially domesticated. With this information, we can surmise that this is about when men started wearing pants, when the domestication of horses became a thing. Now, why women didn't? Possibly because of the gender roles at the time. They didn't get on and use the horses. Much like the horses, they were domesticated, forced to wear shoes too tight for their feet and saddled. Kind of makes the similarities between a corset and a saddle apparent, don't they? Since when were simple things you put on your body gendered? Why do we gender inanimate objects? I wouldn't hesitate to say that it's due to men's taught masculinity and taught want/need to control things, especially sexuality. The need to dominate, a taught need. Or is it? Is this need to dominate and control something learned, or is it something in the blood? Is it the need to dominate and control sexuality because of insecurity, which is more likely? The same insecurity that permeates culture's idea of masculinity. Femininity suffers much of the same problems that masculinity does, the same societal pressures. Pretty, fine, docile, ladylike, attractive, presentable, weak, submissive, subservient, a wife and not a person, a slave, property, dress, skirt, heels, makeup, sweet, elegant. These buzzwords tend to be associated with feminine. Now, again, there is some overlap with some of these words, but generally speaking, they have a particular and peculiar association. That your worth is dictated, no pun intended, by how feminine you are, how good of a wife you'll make someone else. Why is it about someone else? Why allow yourself to be shackled and chained, controlled and domesticated? Why must you be presentable? Why must you hide your sexuality? Is masculinity so toxic that it's unsafe for you too? I think that's obvious. So what must we do to destroy the ideas of masculine and feminine? Destroy these old, outdated, and primitive social constructs. Destroy the very foundations of bondage without consent. Bound to rules, rings, and regulations. Bound to marriage, men, and monogamy. Bound to gender, judgment, and jealousy. Whatever feminine and masculine mean, they are surely shadows of their former selves. Until the inverse effect affects, we will continue to see a repeat of the past, leashed and happy with it. Thank you so much for sitting with me today on my bit of a rant. I'd love to hear from you. We can talk about anything, relationships, sex, love, intimacy, whatever you'd like to. Reach out to me at askingtemptation@gmail.com. I'd like to have a guest speaker or two for the next 2 workshops or so, but in the meantime, we'll be talking about heterosexuality, diving into the heteronormativity that has influenced culture as we see it today. Until then, love you. Bye.